Good evening, my name's Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal here, and it's a great pleasure to welcome so many people to this evening's public talk. Our speaker this evening is, in my opinion, a very interesting man who I came across when he did some research for UCL Policy Lab and Oxford University in connection with the development of our EDI policy, Everyone Belongs. Luke Tryl is the Executive Director of More in Common. I think he's going to tell you a little bit more about the organisation, so I'm not going to steal his thunder too much, but it is an organisation that does, I think, groundbreaking work in trying to identify and engage with public opinion in the United Kingdom. As well as that, you may well have heard Luke, who pops up all over the place as a media commentator on Radio 4, Times Radio, New Statesman, Telegraph, Guardian, all those things, FT on Monday. And before that, he was a special advisor to the Department of Education, to Nicky Morgan, and was Director of Strategy at Ofsted. So Luke's going to talk a little bit about his work, and then he'll take some questions from the audience. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Okay, so I'm hoping I just have to... Oh, it works. That's the first test. Well, firstly, thank you so much, Helen, for that kind introduction, and I'm really pleased to be here today. I've sort of rather grandly called this Britain in 2025, because when Helen asked if I'd be willing to come and give one of these talks, I sort of thought, like, what bits of our work would be most interesting? And in the end, I've decided to try and put in a little bit of everything, which means that either this talk is going to be like a sort of delicious pick and mix, where you get a bit of everything, or it's going to seem random and disjointed. But I'm hoping it's the former rather than the latter. Before we get into it, I thought I would just tell you a little bit about More in Common, why we were established, and what we would do. Some of you will know that the phrase More in Common comes from Joe Cox's maiden speech in Parliament. And More in Common was established following Joe's murder in the run-up to the Brexit referendum. We were established along with the Joe Cox Foundation, and the Joe Cox Foundation does fantastic work which takes forward lots of Joe's passion projects, so work around loneliness, around getting more women into politics, and Syria in particular. What we do is we try and look and understand what are the forces which are driving polarisation in society. Why does it feel like societies, not just in the UK, but across the Western world, are feeling more fragmented and more fractious than they did in the past? And the way that we do that is by spending our time speaking and talking to people. So I spend most of my life in focus groups right around the country. We also do regular polling. Some of you might have seen our polling, really trying to, I guess, firstly understand what people think and why, and then try and share that with others. Because I think since we were founded, I think what we've sort of landed on as our USP is that some of the biggest, I guess, what you might call political shock moments that have occurred, you know, things like Brexit and Donald Trump's first election, indeed his second election, would have seemed far less shocking if people were actually listening to people, if people actually understood what people were saying day to day. So we see a lot of our role in trying to amplify the voices of groups who often feel sort of invisible or ignored in contemporary debates as well. So that's why we do the research that we do. We operate not just in the UK, but in France, Germany, Poland, now Spain, Brazil, and the US. I think I have the best job running our UK operation. Certainly, whilst things can sometimes feel challenging in the UK, as I'll go on to show, I actually think we're one of the least polarised of the countries that More in Common works in. But in every country that we work in, we do a segmentation. Some of you will be familiar with segmentations. What makes this segmentation unique is that it isn't based on demographics at all. So no demographic factors go into our segmentation of the British public, nor do we put in things like sort of partisan political beliefs. This segmentation is based entirely on people's social psychology and values. So it uses things like, some of you will be familiar with Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundation, Karen Stenner's work on authoritarianism. It puts lots of that together and it pumps out, the technical term, these 7 groups. And I always get asked this, so I'll say it now. There is a quiz on our website, so you can go on and find out which segment you are in. Now, these are the British 7. And the reason I wanted to put them up first is because when you're having conversations about things like polarization or political attitudes, there's a temptation, it's even sort of the way that we have laid this out, to think of the segments as a straight line, that you move from one end, the sort of progressive activists, through to the backbone conservatives. That isn't actually how British public opinion aligns. The better way to think about it and to describe it is more like a kaleidoscope, in that different segments come together and move apart depending on the issue at hand. So to give you one example of that, progressive activists, they are the most left-leaning segment on both social issues and economics. They couldn't basically be further away from the group that we call the loyal nationals. They're sort of like, I guess what's become known as the sort of typical Red Wall voter, sort of more socially conservative, traditionally Labour, went to the Conservatives in 2019, some went back to Labour, some now going to Reform. So different outlooks on an issue like immigration, but on an issue like inequality and the role of the state in redistribution, they come together very closely. If you look at the established Liberals, on the other hand, that's your sort of blue wall liberal, kind of Cameronite conservative group, they probably agree with the progressive activists. In fact, they do often agree with the progressive activists on something like immigration, but then they diverge when it comes to questions about tax. Established Liberals tend to prefer lower tax and lower public spending. Progressive activists don't. So I think that image of a kaleidoscope of public opinion is quite a useful way to think about how Britain works, and even thinking about it like that avoids getting into this trap of actually these groups never come together. Now, when we talk to the public, we often ask them, in fact, we ask every week, what do you think are the biggest issues facing the UK? And I think the thing that you'll see from this, we could have gone even further back, is that those big issues are relatively static. They don't change that much. Some of them bob up and down, but almost inevitably the cost of living is number one, followed by the NHS, then usually followed by immigration, although it's quite close to affordable housing, crime, and climate change. There's sometimes a bit of an assumption, I think, in sort of Westminster and the media that climate change is still a sort of fringe issue for lots of people, that only those on the liberal left care about. It's not. It's regularly up there in the top issues. On the other hand, when you ask about typical culture war issues, things which generate a lot of airtime or print time, they basically barely register on this. Actually, a lot of the debates which you see sort of play out and generate the most heat in the media are actually quite an elite exercise. And I think that's quite an important thing to remember, that lots of the clashes that are happening at an elite level. They're not happening to the people that we speak to in focus groups. And I'll give you one example of that. We were doing a focus group, it was a few years ago now, but it was, some of you will remember, there was outrage because I think it was Magdalen College MCR took down a photo of the Queen. Which naturally ended up then on the front page of the Daily Mail, as these things do. And I showed this to a focus group of people in our Loyal National segment, so quite a socially conservative group, and said, what do you think? And they started off in the focus group by saying it's outrageous, it's disrespectful to the Queen, why would they do that? And then someone else chipped in and said, yeah, I know it is disrespectful, but that's just what students do, isn't it? You know, they do the thing, and everyone else in the group agreed. But then they said, why on earth is the Education Secretary commenting on this, though? This was just when we were getting schools back open. They were like, shouldn't he be getting schools back open? Shouldn't he be focused on that? And I thought it really neatly summed up how most people interact with these sort of so-called culture war issues. Yes, they're a bit eye-rolly about it. Yes, they find it a bit frustrating and think students push it too far. But they don't think it's what politicians should be spending their time focusing on. And again, I think remembering that is quite important. You know, my general rule, and it comes out of this, is that the British public are usually pretty sound, right? You know, they like fairness. They believe in decency. They want politicians to focus on the things that matter to them. It's also worth saying, these little balls are the visual representations of the segments. I think it gives you quite a good sort of feel for which issues are more and less polarizing. So cost of living is a top issue for pretty much all of those segments. Supporting the NHS, again, comes in second, top for the progressive activists. You move to levels of immigration, and you can see that there is more of a divide there. Those more socially conservative segments, it's number 3. Some of the more kind of centrist ones, it comes out in the centre, in the middle of their list. And then for the progressive activist segment, it is right down at the bottom. They tend to give it low salience. Climate and environment is the other way round. But what you'll notice about climate and the environment is that even though you still get that split, so the progressive activists here, more socially conservative segments there, actually the gap is far less. And that's one of the important lessons, is that climate and climate politics are far less polarizing than something like immigration. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to assume they're two sides of the same coin. They're not, actually. Even the most socially conservative segment there puts it almost above the halfway mark on their list of top issues. So, what are Britain's strengths when it comes to social cohesion? I thought I'd start with the good news, because someone told me recently that I was getting into a rut to giving a series of presentations about why Britain's so miserable. So I'm going to start with the good stuff. We will unfortunately have to come to some of the bad stuff, but let's start with the good stuff. The first one links to what I was just talking about, and it is a really, really important one. We are not the United States, and it is a really good thing that we are not the United States. We are far less polarized. Now, I put here an example which is sort of on, you know, it leans more towards the right. So if you ask about something like immigration, or in this case it's channel crossings or people at the US border, in the US you get a big Republican-Democrat split in terms of how important it is. Actually over here, Labour and Conservatives both tend to say that it's an issue. Now that's an issue which, you know, the public lean more socially conservative, but there are other issues. So if you ask how worried are you about climate change, there is not a single constituency in the UK where concern about climate change drops below 50%. In Clacton, a constituency I picked at random, some of you might know why, 63% of the public say that they are very or somewhat worried about climate change. So climate isn't polarising. Ukraine isn't polarising. 2/3 of Reform UK voters think it is important for the UK that Ukraine maintains its sovereignty. Now, you wouldn't think that sometimes, looking at the coverage. We do not have that left-right split. And a big part of the reason is that in the UK, we don't have what are known as stacked identities. Some of you will be familiar with this, but for those of you that aren't, what I mean by that is that often, if I sit on a focus group that a US colleague is running, and someone tells me what they think about guns, I can then usually guess what they're going to say about abortion, what they're going to say about immigration, what they're going to say about climate change. We do not have that to the same degree in the UK. I often like to say Brits are wonderfully inconsistent. Again, I did a focus group, I think it was in the Northwest, at the time when it was following George Floyd's murder, and it was footballers taking the knee. And there was a man in the focus group who was furious about small boats and channel crossings, genuinely thought it was, one of the biggest problems facing the country. And then switched on to asking about footballers taking the knee. And he said, well, of course footballers should be doing that. We've got to get racism out of football. And again, I think sometimes highly engaged people tend to have more stacked identities. It is likely that most of you have more stacked identities than the public at large because you think about politics and political issues a lot. Most people don't have them. And I think that is a real strength. Inconsistency often isn't a strength, but in this case, it is. The second strength is that Brits have both and approaches to identity. We're having what I think is a rather painful debate at the moment about what Englishness is. Actually, if you ask the public, they think that you can be English regardless of the colour of your skin, regardless of your religion, regardless of lots of other things. This particular poll, I think, is actually on Britishness, but we've just done Englishness as well. And most people, when you ask whether people are proud or ashamed that Britain is a multi-ethnic society, you get a good chunk, so nearly 50% of the public who say that they're proud. You then get another chunk who I think are equally healthy, who just sort of meet it with a shrug and say, well, I'm neither proud nor ashamed that Britain is a multi-ethnic society. And then you've got about 7% who say they're ashamed. They are the group who are fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea of multi-ethnic Britain. But again, I will point you to the fact that even amongst Reform UK supporters, the party which is, clearly leans most towards the populist right of the main parties, still only 23% of that group. Now, it's a high figure, but I think it gives you a feeling we do have this sense that, Britain is a diverse, different, an inclusive country. And if you ask people about what they're most proud of, this was some work we did shortly before the Queen died about the best things during her reign, and actually improvements in gender equality come second. Britain becoming more diverse is right up there. Improvements in equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual people is up there as well. So it's a source of pride. And I put this one up there as well. Now you might think this is a slightly strange thing to say, what, people are worried about extremism and that's a cohesion strength. The reason that I put it up is that very often, again, when sometimes bad faith actors are talking about this, they will say that it is either the threat to UK when it is comes to extremism is from the far right, or it is from Islamist groups as well. What's really interesting is that 75% of those who say that they are concerned about Islamist extremism are also concerned about far-right extremism. And of that group, the group who say they're concerned about that extremism, nearly 70% say they're concerned about Islamophobia as well. So again, it's not that either or, it's both and, which is a real strength. So I said I was going to come to the bad stuff, and I'll come to that now. Now, you might think for someone who runs an organisation called More in Common that this is quite a damning indictment of my KPIs, but 64% of the public say that the UK feels divided. So it's interesting, we've talked about all those common touchstones that people have, and yet people say it feels divided. But what I think is quite telling is that what is the biggest predictor, or one of the biggest predictors of saying that the UK feels divided, it is feeling like you are struggling in life. So those who are the least able to meet ends meet are the most likely to say that the country feels divided. There is a direct link between people's sense of security and that the system is working for them and how they feel about social cohesion. And on the next slide, I will show you what people said when we asked them to describe Britain in one word. Can any of you, I think Tim's in the audience, he knows the answer, so he can't do it. But can anyone guess what the word is, the biggest word, when you ask people in a poll to describe Britain in a word? Unfair. Unfair? Okay, there's one option.
Broken.
Broken. You are right. That was very good. That is the biggest word. This is why people say I give depressing talks. When you ask the public to describe Britain in a word, broken is what comes out in the middle. So this is a word cloud. The size of the word correlates to how many, or is in fact directly related to how many people said that word. And this matches the experience that we're seeing in lots of our focus groups at the moment. Just this sense that too much of Britain at the moment isn't working for people, that too much of everyday life feels like a struggle. And what that does, and there was a great paper that came out last year on zero-sum thinking. What that does, though, is it reinforces zero-sum thinking. When everything feels like it's struggling, you start to think, if someone else is gaining, I must be losing, and that becomes a threat to cohesion. We see that 72% of the public say that things are getting worse rather than better in Britain at the moment. And that then translates into a wider concern that democracy itself isn't working. Just 31% of the public think that democracy is working at the moment. 1 in 5 think that our politicians are up to the challenges that the country faces, and 3/4 think that the system is rigged at the moment. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because clearly it's bad in of itself, right? If people are thinking that. But the other reason that it matters, and this is what I say to people, when people say, why are people turning away from democracy and moving away from the mainstream, it's because, again, for most people, their relationship with democracy is quite transactional, right? It's, if democracy delivers for me and creates a state that works, then I'll back a democratic system. But if democracy isn't delivering for me, well, yeah, I'm going to be tempted elsewhere by someone who's promising they're going to come in and rip things up and, dogify everything and all of that. You can see the appeal of it because it comes from a sense that, well, I've got this system and it's just not working. And again, a lot of people in this space, certainly like me, care about democracy in of itself. But if it isn't working for people, they will go elsewhere. And you see that here. So this is looking at supporters of different parties and how happy they are across a series of different metrics. And what you can clearly see is that those who are opting for non-mainstream parties, the Greens and Reform UK, are much less likely to be happy with various aspects of their life. So family life, work, social life, finances and love life as well. Now, some of that will correlate with age. So, Green voters tend to be younger, and you tend to be, I think, in general, less happy with your love life when you're younger. I don't know, but that's there. But it's clear there's a pattern there, right, between lack of satisfaction. The other thing that I wanted to touch on, because I suspect, and I wish I could get you to do it live, if many of you did our quiz, you would probably come out in the progressive activist segment. I come out in that segment. And what you tend to find is that progressives are outliers on lots of questions. Now, in some ways, that's kind of unsurprising, right? Like, the nature of being progressive is that you have outlier views that you sort of push or want to push the rest of society to. And if you think of most of the social changes in the UK in the last, well, however long, a lot of them have been driven by progressive activists having outlier views. But when it comes to polarisation, we've just released a new report, and please, if you're interested, do go and read it. I can't do it justice here. What we found was that sometimes, clearly, one of the, perhaps, inarguably the primary driver of progressive backlash is the environment that progressives have to work in, the media environment. There are lots of people for whom weaponising progressive causes can be a good thing either financially or for political reasons. So that's a driver. But there are other drivers too. So we found, for instance, that the people in this progressive activist group tend to overestimate how many people share their progressive views. They don't think it's a majority, but they do think it's by a factor of 2 or 3 higher than it is. And what that means is that you end up in a situation where, if you're a campaigner, particularly for NGOs, you think, maybe I just need to activate existing support than persuade new people. And that is a very different campaigning approach. We also know that progressive activists tend to have stricter criteria about who they would include in a campaign, even if they agree with them on the issue. Now, that's not, I take no view on this. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to invite everyone to every space, because it wouldn't be appropriate, but it can make it harder to build bigger tents. And the other interesting thing is that we found that progressives are more likely to attribute people who disagree with them, to attribute their views to misinformation. And the difficulty there is, it may or may not be true that their views are driven by misinformation, but the difficulty is it's received by the other side as, oh, so you're saying I'm too thick to understand what's true and what's not, and it's more difficult to persuade. And there are a few other examples in the report which I would read, some of it which draws on the work that we did alongside Tim as well on EDI, and just some of the language sometimes can be less accessible to people who would otherwise be allies. This I don't think will surprise anyone, but one of the challenges for Keynesian is that trust is quite divided along political lines. So Reform UK, these dots aren't that distinguishable, but the sort of greeny, turquoisey one is Reform UK. Much more likely to trust something like GB News than to trust the BBC. They're the only group who don't do that. And that can make it difficult to have a sort of shared understanding of the truth. And the other thing is, I talked about misinformation a minute ago. Clearly, there are challenges with misinformation. In fact, when you ask the public, a third of people will say that they have been misled by fake misinformation online. Now, if you assume most people in polls don't like to admit that they've made a mistake, that is likely to be the very bottom end of the estimate. Most people don't like to say that they've been misled. So clearly, misinformation is a challenge. It's part of the reason we ask the second question about friends and family as well, because sometimes people are a bit more honest about them. What I would say on this, and I think where we come down at More in Common is, I think a lot of the debate on misinformation focuses on the supply side. It is, how can we better regulate algorithms? How can we clamp down on social media companies and that piece? Now, that is really important, right? But actually, you're always going to slightly be playing whack-a-mole with that, because there will always be new ways that misinformation can come out through the supply side. I actually think it's more interesting to look at the demand side. Why do people embrace misinformation? Just to give you another example from a focus group, this was a focus group looking at international conflict. It was people on who took one particular view on it, and I showed an image which was a fake AI-generated image of a child in in terrible conditions, but the child had 6 fingers on each hand, so it was clearly fake. And I asked the group, I said to them, what do you think about this? And they said, yeah, it's terrible, it's showing you what's happening. I then said, but have you seen the child's got 6 fingers? They're like, well, that doesn't matter. Because it's clearly representing what's happening anyway. And that's what I mean by the demand side. The misinformation is clearly filling something for lots of people, and sort of addressing that, I think, is more important. I'll very quickly just talk about how this relates to some of the politics. Where did all of that discontent, or how did that discontent manifest itself in the election? Well, people voted for change. They really, whatever lack of enthusiasm they may have had for Labour, they really wanted the Conservatives out and did everything they could to make it happen, because they felt we needed change. Rishi Sunak's stick with the plan only appealed to 26% of the public. But when it came to voting, I think this is one of the interesting charts and highlights that disillusionment. It wasn't just the Conservatives that lost out. In fact, the biggest predictor of losing vote share at the last election was being an incumbent of any sort, of any party, aside from the Liberal Democrats. They are the one exception there. So you see those big drops, actually, in Labour held seats. In Labour's vote share, obviously the almost universal Conservative one there. I think that might be Liz Truss right at the very end of that one. And then, the SNP as well. And you also saw, and I think this chart's maybe a little bit tricky to understand, but it basically shows there was this gravitational pull at the last election away from the 2 big parties and towards others, towards new entrants. In fact, the 2 main parties got a particularly low share of the vote. And again, that is that disillusionment manifesting itself since the election. You can see Labour falling from their 34% which in of itself was higher than lots of pollsters were thinking. Some pollsters, more in common included, overestimated Labour's share, slightly less than others, but we all overestimated it, down to this kind of incredible situation we have at the moment, right? And I mean in a sort of unique way, where we now have three parties who are basically tied for first place. And I talked about those segments, and you can see how they've shifted since the election there. So the shifts between 2019 and 2024. Interestingly, Labour, despite gains elsewhere, have actually now lost votes consistently with that progressive activist group. They actually lost a big chunk of their vote before the election. Conservatives losing across the board. You know, the fact that they're down to under 40% of the vote with the group called Backbone Conservatives should show the challenge that they are facing. And then that rise of Reform UK, particularly with those more socially conservative groups. This is basically unreadable, so I won't spend too much time. But basically what's happening is the public are really impatient for change, right? They want to see change happening, and rightly or wrongly, and I'm sure lots of people in here might think means testing the winter fuel allowance was a good thing to do, it has been received by the public as a betrayal of trust because it wasn't in the manifesto. And more than, I would compare it with those of you who remember the Liberal Democrats breaking their tuition fees pledge. It is that level of anger that you receive from focus groups, which again goes to this sort of pox on all your houses feeling, leads to a sense that Labour are underperforming on the issues that matter. So blue is people think Labour, the government is doing well on these issues. Red is badly. And again, this is, when you talk to people in groups, it's because realistically or not, they sort of expected new government and pressing the change button, I thought it would be better by now. And then you have the rise of Reform UK. So who is backing Reform UK? Maybe unsurprisingly, given the patterns of support for the populist right elsewhere, that there is a big education gap. So those who have less formal education tend to be more likely to back Reform UK. There's an interesting age split as well, or what I might actually call a lack of age split. What's interesting about Reform UK is traditionally, when you look at parties of the right, there's quite a clear age gradient, and there certainly is with the Conservatives. There's much less of one with Reform UK, but there is a gender split there. So Reform UK are much more male. In fact, your typical Reform voter is a Gen X man. And a big divergence. What's interesting is at the same time, more younger men might be thinking about supporting Reform UK, young women are going the other way. So we've had the Greens leading along Gen Z women basically since the general election. So it's not just people going one way, there is a divergence there. What also makes Reform UK stand out is, and no other party has an issue profile like this, people will pick a mix of issues. Those who voted for Reform in July almost uniquely picked immigration as their top issue. You know, people like to say, oh, people are voting for Reform because they're anti-climate change. Again, they're not. It was 4%. But that is shifting slightly. So the people who didn't vote for Reform in July, but would vote for them now, are slightly, I didn't actually, oh no, I did put that in, are slightly different to the people that voted for them before. They tend to be more moderate, they tend to be more female, and they tend to be it's still more male, but they're more female, and they're less online. And the really interesting thing is one of the biggest sort of predictors of how moderate a Reform UK supporter is how online they are. So people, and the test of that is we ask, do you post about politics online? So people, Reform supporters who post about politics online tend to be much more likely to say that multiculturalism is bad, much more likely to have supported Trump, more likely to lean towards the view that legalising gay marriage is wrong. Their less online supporters are less likely to say that. And one of the challenges reformers may face as they try and grow bigger tent is that the group of voters they now need to win, you know, if Nigel Farage is serious that he's going to be the next Prime Minister, the next group that they're going to get are even more moderate. They are basically people who are so upset with the status quo. So of those who've switched from another party to Reform since the election, 95% say that Britain is on the wrong track. That is their unifying factor. But their core supporters, the people who powered them to 15% in the election, are much more concerned with sort of traditional populist right issues like immigration. There's going to be a tension that Reform UK faces going forward. And I'm going to very quickly, in my last 4 minutes of talking, give the answers. How to do this? I'm not really. But just some sort of top line thoughts to leave you with. The first thing is, look, I said people's relationship with democracy is transactional. One of the best ways that you can show people that democracy in the mainstream works is, well, by making it work, by delivering. I think delivery is really important, you know, and when people are saying, you talk to people in a focus group and they talk about trying to get an NHS appointment now, again, it's that constant sense of struggle. It's the constant sense that any interaction with public services, you're met with this almost computer says no mentality, and that makes people not just, you know, depressed that something isn't working, but it's really frustrating. You know, when you feel like you ring up the GP at 8:01 and suddenly you've missed all the appointments for the day, it doesn't just make you sad, it makes you think, I want to tear down this whole system, right? So there is definitely something about delivery, and delivery above squiggly lines on a graph, right? You can talk about growth, but if you grow the UK through boosting London and the South East, we're going to remake all of the problems that we had previously, right? Because other people don't share in that growth. Local matters. I showed you the very depressing, how would you describe the UK? Well, when you ask people how they describe their local area, you don't get broken in the middle. You get quiet, you get nice, you get rural, peaceful, rundown is there as well, but people are much more proud locally than they are of what's happening nationally. So how can you focus on the hyper-local? And I do think for all of its challenges, when the last government announced its levelling up policy, and you would talk to people in focus groups, they would say, oh, finally my area is going to get the attention it deserves. You know, and it's what I think was particularly sad about the fact that that policy agenda wasn't delivered, because you got that boost in trust and then it crashed off. You know, so how can you make people's high streets feel, you know, like they're worth going to again, like they're safe again? And when you ask people about local budget, it is their parks and green spaces. The most depressing focus groups I do are often not on national issues. It's when I talk to, you know, young parents who say, well, I can't take the kids to the park down the road because all the swings have been tied up, there's glass all over the floor, and I'm worried that they'll pick up a needle. And again, what that does is it makes people retreat, because they pull out of the public space because they think that the public space isn't safe. Threat perception really matters to people. What do I mean by threat perception? One of the tests that we use, and it feeds into our segmentation, and it's really predictive of where you stand on issues like crime, immigration, is threat. It's, do you think the world is becoming a more dangerous or a more safe place? How do you address those feelings of threat perception through public policy, through institutions? You know, again, if you're a politician, I think it's one of the reasons that what is often, I think, wrongly called low-level crime is so damaging, because when it's something like a burglary or having a phone snatched or something like that, it gets to you personally, and again, it makes you more likely to retreat. Build on the response to the riots. The riots were clearly, in lots of ways, quite a dark moment for the country. But what wasn't was the response to them. And again, you know, what got lost, I think, in lots of the coverage is that the overwhelming majority of the public think that the people who were involved in clean-up after the riots represented the real Britain, not those who took part. Again, you know, Nigel Farage was, I think, generous to say, sort of, you know, ambivalent in his condemnation of the rights. But again, 69% of reform voters think those who helped to clear up. There is something about integration. I think that the public think we are becoming too atomised and that perhaps having higher expectations on what we require from integration. But what's interesting is that, and it's not on here, when you ask people whose responsibility is integration, is it people, is it immigrants who come to the UK, is it particular groups? They say it's everyone's responsibility. It is a two-way street on integration, that everyone should be involved. And then the final thing that I will leave you with, and this is some work that we've been doing for a while now with UCL, is the importance of respect. Now, when I talk about delivery, I think delivery gets you half of the way there, but I think it needs something else as well, and that is convincing people that their contribution is being respected. Because what a lot of people think is that in recent years we've started to align respect with having a degree, having a well-paid job, living in a big city, rather than respecting contribution. People would say, I realised during the pandemic that actually, it was people who, shop assistants, refuse collectors who kept the show on the road during the pandemic, yet they don't get the respect that they deserve. And so how we can think about respect for contribution, I think, is really important. Because if you see the areas, this is an MRP map of where people think respect, we ask people what's the most important attribute for a politician, and the areas which are deepest purple are those where they said that respect for ordinary people was most important. And if you look at it, and if I had here our MRP of the areas of the country, leaving Scotland, the areas of England and Wales that are going to reform UK, it would map almost entirely onto those areas where people want to see more respect from politicians. And it's not just politicians, right? Institutions have a role to play as well. There is a group of institutions that people both trust and feel respected by, the NHS, charities, schools, the military, but lots of others which aren't up there. And actually how institutions can reach out and pass that respect test really matters. I will stop there. That was a quick hand through. I'm not sure I entirely gave the solutions, but maybe we can do that in questions.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating, as you might see from my millions of photographs I took, in case you want to keep the slides private afterwards. But I'm really interested in two things. Well, lots of things you said, but one thing that I found was interesting was this idea that when you poll people, culture wars barely register. But if you read the mainstream media, or hear a lot of politicians speaking, you would think they were a really salient issue. And I wonder what that says about how far the mainstream media and politicians affect what the public sees as a salient issue and what they don't. Do you have a feel for that from your research?
I think it's a good issue. And look, I asked a senior journalist at a broadsheet newspaper, said our stuff. I was like, look, this is, I think we were talking particularly about the debate around gender identity. And I said, why do you keep doing stories? I mean, it seems like every other day you have a story. And they showed me, they said, this is the sort of standard clicks we get on an article. This is when the article mentions trans, and it jumps up. And I think I think what gets missed is, there is very often, I think, quite high human interest in these stories because it's new, it's different for people, but that then gets confused by politicians as, and this is what the public want us to be talking about. Actually, very often it's, people read this stuff, might be interested in it, might be curious in it. It doesn't then mean they want politicians focusing on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then the other thing, he may kill me for doing this, but I see Alan Rennick in the audience from UCL, and I'm interested, I know that he's done some research on what you were talking about democracy not working, and why you think the sort of trade-offs that people think they have between different values when they're thinking about democracy. And I don't know if you had anything, if you don't mind, I've really put you on the spot and I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but I wonder if you could have a mic. I just wonder if you're interested, because I remember talking to you about some polling you did about people's attitudes to government and democracy and institutions, and how, and what, some of the stuff you did about what that demonstrated why that was. Sorry, this is Alan Rennick, who's part of the Constitution Unit at University College London.
Thank you, Helen. Yes, great to see you, Luke. And thank you so much for the presentation. Really fascinating stuff. So, yes, I mean, our work fitted very much with the work that you've done with another bit of UCL, the UCL Policy Lab, focusing on the respect agenda, and highlighted the degree to which people feel disrespected by politicians. And I mean, our perception was that was across the board, that all members of the public feel disrespected by politicians. And we were focusing, so you focused in your talk there at least very much on the kind of policy agenda, and the sense that people don't feel respected by the system because it doesn't deliver what they want. In our research, we were also looking at how politicians talk, the discourse of politics, and we were particularly doing our research at the time when Boris Johnson was getting into quite a lot of trouble. And what we found was that people really cared about that as well. And they felt so utterly disrespected by politicians who seemed not to take them seriously, who seemed to think that it was fine to lie to them, to say whatever might work in order to sway their opinion. And people could see that that was being done by politicians, and they absolutely hated that it was being done to them. So, for our research, we were focusing. I mean, it doesn't disagree in any way with what Luke has just set out, but we were focusing particularly on how politicians behave towards each other, and how the kind of the top end of the political system, if you like, functions. And we found, really strongly that people want a democratic system that is more respectful within itself. And that shows the sorts of values that you're demonstrating people care about in their own lives as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, totally, absolutely. And I guess that the bit at the end there, getting a respect, you're entirely right. You can deliver, but if people feel that, I remember during focus groups, during Partygate when it was coming out, and people, everyone had a story of what they had sacrificed, whether it was, missing a kid's graduation, a wedding being slimmed down, missing a funeral. And they would say, and yet they were partying in Downing Street. And that for so many people was the ultimate disrespect for them, because it was politicians not taking their conservative, and it's so corrosive and Barnard Castle as well was seen as another example, because it was like, are you really taking the mick? You went for an eye test? Come on, we're cleverer than that. That was what would come through from people. So, yeah, absolutely in agreement.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for some questions. Okay, I have a hand here at the front. I take questions from women as well as men, so I'll have one here, there, yes, so here, and then here, and then here.
Right. Could you say a little bit more about how people make a judgment about, let's say, crime, whether crime is getting worse, or even cost of living? Now, I happen to look at, read reports on the crime statistics, the two different ways that they're measured, and, but I'd get another view just by reading the Oxford Mail. This cost of living as well. I mean, it probably says something about me and the street I live in and my friend. But actually, most people I know aren't having a tough time with cost of living. But when you ask people, it sounds very uncaring and unsympathetic to say, no, cost of living, because somehow we form a judgment, we get information, or we have come to that conclusion that this is the most important issue. I'd even say respect. I mean, I don't really know do politicians respect me or not. How do I even?
Yeah.
I don't meet them.
That's good.
Yeah.
Are we doing a few?
Yeah, why don't you, yes.
I'll come back. Yeah, it's a really good look, and I often caveat. People get quite annoyed with me sometimes when I'll personally say people have a sense that, or people think that, and they're like, "This is the truth. Why are you saying it?" But I always caveat with that because I'm dealing in public opinion rather than the reality. And one of the things we know is that even in times when crime has lowered, people's perception of it is that it is going up. I think part of that is
that certainly most recently it's that some of the more visible types of crime that people are more likely to experience have gone up. So things like relatives being, elderly relatives being scammed online. We know that has risen, and that's more personal, or seeing shoplifting. On the cost of living, I think it is as much about, I think basically, I mean, look, the US shows this. People, even if your wage is going up, people really, really hate inflation. They just hate inflation. Like, I think we have unequivocal proof that people hate inflation. And what we found during the energy crisis period was, it wasn't the overall level of the bills they were getting so much, but the unpredictability. I don't know what the next bill is going to be. And that and that obviously plays into a sort of sense of lack of agency as well, or I don't know what my mortgage is going to be as a result. So I think it's that as much as the absolute levels of it.
Thank you so much for a very interesting and important talk. I found it really interesting what you said in the beginning, how the UK is polarized but not in a binary way like the US. And my impression is that countries that get polarized, they go into those binaries. Like personally, I work on Poland and polarization in Poland, and this is exactly what we see. So I guess my question is, what makes the UK so special? And I'm sure it's more a question of the historical conditions that have shaped the society in a way it is, but I'm just very curious, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And the other example that I often use to prove it is that, Donald Trump made that joke that I could walk down the street and shoot someone and still get, still win. And the truth is, he probably would still get 40% of the vote, right? Like we know, and the Democrat would still get 40% of the vote, and then you're playing with 10%. We clearly don't have that here, right? Like the Conservatives in the last Parliament polled as high as 55% in one opinion poll, as low as 18%. We have a highly responsive electorate that aren't in those camps. Now, that can cause its own problems, as I think we're slightly seeing at the start of this government. But it is definitely true people are much less rigid. And I just think part of it comes down to, it's that point about stacked identities. People are much more likely to view things issue by issue and how it affects them, rather than sitting in a tribe, which of course has historical, cultural, different roots.
Okay. Now I'm going to take, I can see two hands, so I'm going to this one here and then the woman right at the back. So if I can have the woman in the pink. Oh, sorry, yes, this one, and then the woman, and yeah, then we'll go that way. I think that will probably be it. Yeah.
Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation, Luke. One thing I have not heard you mention, I was quite intrigued, was human rights, European Convention on Human Rights more specifically. I have recently listened to you reflect on the issue at the Fringe event, specifically on the ECHR, and explaining that it's not necessarily an issue that attracts particular attention from the part of the public. On the other hand, today, very interestingly, you highlighted how immigration comes at the very top of, or close to the top of the issues that attract the attention of the public. And what I'd be very keen to hear your thoughts on is whether there's certain conflation of the two issues, and whether there's any analysis. When you refer to immigration in particular, what do people understand by immigration? Is it legal migration? Is it illegal? Is it channel crossings? And alongside all that, what is the role, in that equation that the ECHR, how it's presented in the UK, play? What role does it play? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So we could do an entire talk on this. On the point about conflation of legal and illegal immigration, yeah, it is absolutely there. So if you ask the public, as we did recently, to estimate the proportion of migration to the UK which is legal, or that which is illegal or irregular, the public say it's about 50-50. We know that, in reality, it's about 10%, I think less than 10% that is illegal or regular. So that's part of it. Part of it is the overall quantum, like the numbers that, and I think, even people in the more left-leaning segments say 800,000 people, that just seems like a lot of people. And then there is something particularly for people which is deeper rooted about small boats because it's such a powerful visual image of people coming over on small boats, and it appears disorderly, and people say, well, it's not fair, it's people jumping the queue, it's that. I think small boats in particular triggers lots of the sort of core values, around sort of fairness, and people really don't like it. And also it's the Channel, right? That, the Channel has such an important role in British national identity. So I think that they're the main issues. On the role of the court, look, I mean, people, as you know from that talk, people start with the court, it's about 2-1 in favour of remaining in the court. People don't like the idea of going through something similar to Brexit, which is, the numbers drop when you pitch it against having total freedom on immigration, though still, it's still not, it's still more want to stay than leave. But I think the bigger challenge there is, whenever we talk about something like the European Court of Human Rights or the Human Rights Act, it's always about what it's stopping us from doing. It's always about how it's making things harder and more difficult to do what people want. And I actually think we need to spend more time exploring, how does this benefit us? How do you actually get something out of that? Because the problem is, at the moment, the debate is, we can't deport this person, and then we defend it because, everyone's entitled to have their due process and rights, which is obviously clearly right. But then we don't go into the thing, but also the court is doing this, this, and this that you do like as well. So I think that's where we need to maybe shift.
Okay, I've got the person in pink and then the person in the corner. Can I take those two questions together so we get the answers in for everybody? So, yes, so this is somebody in pink in the middle, and then the person in the very far right corner there.
Do you have any sense, when you're sitting in your groups, that there is an element of, when it comes to elections, that the stacking, perhaps even in the US, is not that predictive of how people eventually vote? So I'm thinking of the example I've read about, the West Coast liberals working in tech who ended up voting for Trump because actually the thing that really got their goat was the idea of tech regulation. And they were willing to put up with a load of kind of weird and horrible stuff because what really engaged them was the tech regulation. And I'm wondering, when you're sat in groups in the UK, whether you have any sense of what are the triggers that might make people put a cross in a particular box on the day that doesn't necessarily fall neatly into your groups or your segments?
Thanks, Luke. That was a great talk. I work on climate and international development, so it's been an interesting day for me. Nice to come to something about the UK. So going back to the previous speaker from Poland, I was just sort of reflecting on, what makes us a bit different. And I was thinking about the sort of British sense of fair play and justice. And I would just be interested to hear a little bit more in your solutions about what you think that means for, social justice, social mobility, and how that has a really key role to play in bringing people together, because I do think that is something which does unite people.
Both great questions. I think you're absolutely right that sometimes there are just overriding factors which, take over almost everything else for people. I often say that, people often ask, why did so many Remainers vote for Boris Johnson in 2019? And it's because if you look at it, and when you were doing focus groups, and this is why you should always do focus groups and not just polling, because you understand the kind of why of people do what they do, not just the what. It was that slogan, get Brexit done, everyone focuses on the Brexit bit. It was the done bit, which was more important for a lot of people. People were just exhausted, right? Like most people who weren't that engaged, who were probably softly attached to the EU, were sad we left, were like, we just can't go on with these rows anymore. And so that appealed. So you're absolutely right, there are those sort of triggers occasionally, and it then looks really odd. It's like you're voting against your interests, but actually that was the most salient one. On the point about, I totally agree with you on sort of, fairness, fair play, everyone having an equal chance is really important. And actually, the work that we've done with Oxford and with Tim's team on EDI shows you how you can have quite a different conversation about EDI when it is about that sort of level playing field, when it's about opportunities for people. You know, that attracts high support. But, you know, by a 5-to-1 margin we found in that research, people think EDI is a good rather than a bad thing. It's just that then sometimes people think that that the emphasis is wrong or class has been ignored, and why is that not part of the solution as well? So it's sort of building on that, but I totally agree with you. If you want to tackle polarization, you know, if you want to build cohesion, and if you want to drive social progress, that fair play and decency baseline is absolutely the place to be.
And then the question about...
Oh, did I miss one? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, no. Well, I don't know. Do you feel you have had answers to your questions? Oh, people. Yeah.
Not quite.
Okay, sorry.
When you're sitting in groups, what do you think those, to take your word done, what are those sort of trigger issues now that you think
Oh, I see.
that might kind of push people over the line? Just interested in what your mind is.
Yeah, so I think I think at the moment it is that, I sort of hinted at that, is that sort of sense that computer says no culture. It's that sense that every time, too much of trying to do things which should be easy is too difficult, and so therefore I'm going to vote for someone who's going to tear down the whole system, even if there are lots of consequences from that I might like. It's that, I sometimes call it everyday frictions. People think there are too many everyday frictions in their lives, and they want something to be done about it.
Okay, we could go on for a very long time. It was a fascinating talk and a fascinating conversation, so thank you all for taking part in it. When I was talking to Luke before he came in here, I was talking to him about operating focus groups, and something he said that I thought was really interesting was how often when you speak to people, especially in, I suppose, what you might call left behind bits of the country, he says, people have never asked me my views on this before at this length. And I think this does illustrate the real importance for all of us, whatever solutions we might come up with, to listening to people. So thank you very much for your work and for sharing it with us, Luke.
Thank you.
Just before I say and hooray or clap, just want you to know, if you like free cultural or political or various events at Mansfield, tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, you can see the poster on the way out. We have a free classical concert. It's called the French Flute. Everyone's welcome, 7 o'clock. You can just show up. And then our next public talk, which is Friday, as usual, Friday the 7th of March at 5:30, is Professor Lida Wunn from Rutgers University talking about the shape of sex, a history of non-binary gender before modernity. And if we think this is a new issue, she will be talking about her research on non-binary identities between 200 and 1400 in the Common Era. So really old history. So come to that, and then the week after that, the last one of this term, will be Mansfield alum Martha Swales talking about gardening for everyone and her new book, Give It a Grow. So there we are. Spring will be coming, but I'd just like to thank you very much for being here.